Welcome to our study this morning of chapter 8 of the book of Esther. The Jews' enemy, Haman, has been hanged, but the Jews are still under imminent threat because of the decree that he had persuaded the king to sign, and such a decree in Persia was irreversible. And so chapter 8 is going to reveal that the king will give Haman's house to Esther and elevate Mordecai to the position that Haman recently held. And in response to Esther's plea, Ahasuerus will allow Mordecai to issue a decree giving the Jews permission to defend themselves on the day set for their destruction. Consequently, the Jews rejoiced over their anticipated deliverance. Notice verses 1 and 2 of chapter 8. On that day, King Ahasuerus gave the house of Haman, the enemy of the Jews, to Queen Esther, and Mordecai came before the king, for Esther had disclosed what he was to her. The king took off his signet ring, which he had taken away from Haman, and gave it to Mordecai. And Esther set Mordecai over the house of Haman. On the same day that Haman had been hanged, King Ahasuerus gave all that Haman possessed to Queen Esther. Probably the gift was based on the principle that the possessions of a criminal convicted of a capital crime were forfeited to the crown. And the king could have then disposed of these things however he chose, which is what he did. Haman's house would have been included in all that pertained to it, including all the contents, the furniture, the treasures, all the holdings, even the servants that are attached to that property. Why give these possessions to Esther? Obviously, the king wants to show his affection for his queen. And the gift may also have been intended to express his profound gratitude to her for bringing Haman's crimes to his attention, or to compensate her for the mental anguish that Haman had inflicted on her and her people. You come to verse 1, the latter part of that verse, Esther revealed to the king her relationship to Mordecai. And with her promotion, Mordecai became the king's prime minister with all the authority that Haman had previously enjoyed. Ahasuerus gave Mordecai his signet ring, the same ring that he had earlier taken back from Haman. And as if to complete the story of Haman's defeat, Esther placed his enemy Mordecai over his house. While Esther still owned Haman's possessions, it appears that Mordecai moved into Haman's former residence and became the proprietor of all of his holdings that likely would have been considerable. Although Mordecai had served as Esther's guardian and adoptive father, she was no longer subservient to him. Rather, as the queen, she gave him direction regarding these affairs. As we come to verses 3 through 8, we'll see the queen make an appeal for her people, the Jewish people. Then Esther spoke again to the king and fell at his feet, wept, and implored him to avert the evil scheme of Haman the Agagite and his plot which he had devised against the Jews. The king extended the golden scepter to Esther, so Esther arose and stood before the king. Then she said, "If it pleases the king, and if I have found favor before him, and the matter seems proper to the king, and I am pleasing in his sight, let it be written to revoke the letters devised by Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, which he wrote to destroy the Jews who were in all the king's provinces. For how can I endure to see the calamity which will befall my people? And how can I endure to see the destruction of my kindred?" So King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther and to Mordecai the Jew, "Behold, I have given the house of Haman to Esther, and him they have hanged on the gallows because he had stretched out his hand against the Jews. Now you write to the Jews as you see fit, in the king's name, and seal it with the king's signet ring. For a decree which is written in the name of the king and sealed with the king's signet ring may not be revoked. All through this story, though it goes without having been said specifically, there are significant tides, competing forces within that empire. And the Jews are well regarded by many people in significant places, but they are also despised by some factions. And this is all part of what we've been seeing, and it will come to fruition. In verses 3 and 4, in Persia, a royal decree could not be altered, it couldn't be revoked once it was issued. Therefore, even if the king had shown favor to Esther and Mordecai, the Jews still were in danger. It had been decreed that on the 13th day of the 12th month, the Jewish people were to be destroyed. That's chapter 3, verse 13. We know of that declaration. To solve the problem, Esther again appeared before the king, apparently in circumstances similar to those found earlier in the book. Although the author didn't say that she came uninvited into his presence, he spoke again of the king's extending his golden scepter to Esther. Takes note of that. This gesture was made after she had addressed him and fallen at his feet and wept and begged him to save her people, to not allow this evil scheme to befall them. The picture presented in these verses has been somewhat puzzling to some. Why was it necessary for Esther to plead with the king for all the lives of her people? Had not he granted her request at the second banquet in chapter 7? Also, the behavior of Esther here seems to some incongruent with what a regal queen would have done, who had to be asked, 3 times what she wanted previously. And now she's right out with it. Now, the answer to these questions can probably be explained by the king's character or lack of it. Ahasuerus is portrayed as a person who could only think about one matter at a time. And when Haman was identified as an evil man and an enemy, the king, of course, was furious about that. Then when the king found the opportunity to accuse him of assaulting the queen, he had Haman executed. And once he'd given Haman's house and position to others, the king is satisfied. His wrath is satiated. Regarding Esther's connection to the Jewish race that had been condemned to death, either the king had not understood properly or had forgotten about it. There are times where Esther seems to be fairly clueless. Esther had to remind the king of the problem that still existed, and to do so, she changed her tactics, changed her approach. In contrast to her earlier reluctance to reveal her wishes, this time she falls at his feet and implores him to save her people, emphasizing yet again that the Jews were hated by Haman, who had devised this plot against them. Linda Day noted the change in Esther's approach, and she had this to say. As she has appeared composed, almost stoic on previous visits to Ahasuerus, her sobs and begging take the reader quite by surprise, for it's out of character for her to behave in such a fashion. It shows great distress. And by revealing her desperation on this occasion, Esther again demonstrates wisdom. A wise person knows when and how to change tactics in order to achieve their objective. This approach by Esther was successful. The king extended his golden scepter and seems to indicate his approval of her request. And as a result, she stood before the king, accepted as one whose request is about to be granted. In verse 5, Esther's formal request was prefaced by 4 ifs. 4 reasons that she hoped the king would grant her petition. Number 1, if it pleases the king, that implies that she would not have him do anything that's against his will. Secondly, in saying, if I have found favor before him, she's asking him to remember his love for her, his affection for her. And she's asking further that if it seems proper to the king, suggesting that she wanted him to do only what's right in his own eyes. That's number 3. And number 4, by adding, if I am pleasing in his sight, she's inviting him to look upon her countenance and to see how loving and how lovely she is. Having set these conditions, Esther finally makes her request. She wants the king to have a decree written to revoke the former decree, the letters devised by Haman, which he wrote to destroy the Jews throughout the empire. Esther's careful, as she has been before, not to mention that those letters had been sent out by the king's authority. Esther's plea seems to imply that she didn't see the king's former edict as irrevocable. She evidently thought that the king could exercise his royal authority and cancel the previous order. But if he'd done so, or I should say, if he had done so, much bloodshed would have been avoided. There'd have been no need for violence. And that, of course, is always preferable. In verse 6, after this, Esther gave her reason for making the appeal. The Jews were her people. The Jews are her kindred. And so she identifies with them, and she could not stand to think of them being destroyed, just summarily destroyed, because of one egotistical, wicked man's hatred. Her appeal was personal. She didn't base her petition on the king's appreciation for the Jews. I mean, he had Jews in significant places in his administration. But she based it on his affection for her. Do not allow my people to be destroyed, she said in effect, because it'll break my heart. The text doesn't mention here the possibility of Esther's dying along with her people, but that's certainly there. Perhaps she no longer feels endangered. She now expects a special dispensation from her husband, the king, to save her and her people. Or she may have thought that it was unnecessary to make the point at this time. I mean, if the king spared the Jewish people, then her own safety would be a moot point. Or perhaps she was exhibiting just unselfishness. She's more concerned about what would happen to her people than to herself. Any of those is possible. In verses 7 and 8, the king, persuaded by the queen, agrees to her request. To Queen Esther and to Mordecai the Jew, who appears here for the first time in this scene, the king declared that he had already done a great deal for them and that he would do more. He'd already given the house of Haman to Esther, and he'd ordered Haman to be hanged because he had stretched out his hands against the Jews. Furthermore, the king went on to say that he would save the Jews from the calamity that was awaiting them by allowing Esther and Mordecai to write whatever they desired in the king's name. And the phrase that's translated as you see fit is literally according to the good in your eye. The decree they wrote, like the original decree, would be irrevocable. Couldn't modify it, couldn't cancel it. The king didn't specify what should be written in the decree, but it is likely that he had in mind the solution found in the letter that Mordecai was to write. Indeed, if the initial law was irrevocable, it would be difficult to imagine any other way by which the Jews might be saved than what eventually occurs. The reader may be disappointed that Ahasuerus didn't do more. In fact, his response to Esther's tears and impassioned appeals to some sounds rather cold, as if he were saying, don't bother me about this problem. I don't get that from the reading, but some commentators allege that. He has done, indeed, all that he can do. There's nothing more for him to do because of the Persians' inviolable law. And it is possible that his reply here is based on the fact that he just can't do anything more for the Jews other than allow them to write the decree that Mordecai is about to write. His hands were tied by the rule of the king's law, a principle that apparently is part of the foundation of the Persian Empire. And the fact that he turned over the writing of the document to others is consistent with his behavior throughout the book. In verses 9 through 14, the writing of the new decree allows the Jews to defend themselves. So the king's scribes were called at that time in the 3rd month. This is the month of Sivan. And on the 23rd day, as it was written according to all that Mordecai commanded to the Jews, the satraps, the governors, and the princes of the provinces, which extended from Ethiopia to India, 127 provinces, to every province according to its script, to every people according to their language, as well as to the Jews according to their script and their language. He wrote in the name of King Ahasuerus and sealed it with the king's signet ring and sent letters by couriers on horses, riding on steeds sired by the royal stud. In them the king granted Jews who were in each and every city the right to assemble and to defend their lives, to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate the entire army of any people or province which might attack them, including children and women, and to plunder their spoil. On the day in all of the provinces of King Ahasuerus, the 13th day of the 12th month, that is the month of Adar, a copy of the edict to be issued as a law in each and every province was published to all the peoples, so that the Jews would be ready for this day to avenge themselves on their enemies. The couriers hastened and, impelled by the king's command, went out riding on the royal steeds, and the decree was given out at the citadel of Susa. Mordecai authors this decree in the name of Ahasuerus that allows his people to defend themselves on the day that they were to be exterminated by the previous decree. Verses 9 and 10, the facts about the writing and the dissemination of the writing are given before the contents are revealed. In verses 9 and 10, there are a number of details regarding the proclamation. Number one, by whom the decree was written, the king's scribes. That's going to be necessarily a large number of scribes because it is a large empire made up of many different ethnicities and language groupings. And so they're going to have scribes that can translate into all of these various dialects and languages. Every people, according to their language, are to be able to read this decree. When it was written, on the 23rd day of the 3rd month, the month of Sivan, that corresponds to May, June, 2 months and 10 days after the king's first decree had been made public, about 8 months before the date set for the Jews' annihilation. Commentators have suggested that the first readers of the book would have compared these 70 days to the 70 years of Babylonian captivity. For 70 days, the Jews were under a death sentence. Then they were delivered from the certainty of destruction, just as the Jews had been delivered from the Babylonian captivity after 70 years. Who composed it? Mordecai. In his role as prime minister, he had a right to command that the people in the provinces obey the decree. To whom is it written? It's written to the Jews and to the leaders of all of the provinces of the entire empire, all 127 provinces from India to Ethiopia, really Cush. How was it written? In the script and language of each group within every province, so that each could read or hear the decree in his own language. The writer made a point of saying that the letter was also sent to the Jews and written according to their script and language. By whose authority was it sent? King Ahasuerus, the emperor of the Persian Empire. Mordecai not only wrote the decree in the name of the king, but he also sealed it with the king's signet ring. How was the decree sent? We learn by couriers on horses. The messengers used the best horses, horses that were the product of the royal stud, to deliver this decree throughout the empire. Verses 11 and 12, we see that the contents of the decree are then summarized. The Jews everywhere were granted permission to assemble, that is, to gather their forces and to defend their lives and to defeat any who attacked them. If the Jews had resisted without having Mordecai's decree, they would have been in violation of the Persian law. And prior to the counter decree, their choice was either to die passively at the hands of local enemies on the design of Haman, or to rebel against them and face the wrath of the Persian army. The same words found in the original decree are used in this edict. It is after a Persian style. Just as the enemies of the Jews had been granted the right to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate Jews, now the Jews are granted equal rights to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate all those that attempt to slaughter them. In addition, the decree gave the Jews permission to plunder the spoil of their attackers, though they did not exercise that right. The edict specified when the Jews were allowed to defend themselves, to destroy their enemies on the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar, corresponds to February, March, the day previously set for their destruction. On that day, according to the first decree, the Jews' enemies could use any means to destroy the Jews, but on the same day, the Jews would now defend themselves, and they could kill their enemies and take their enemies' goods as plunder. According to Paul T. Butler, the Edict of Mordecai specifically allows only defensive action. The Jews are not permitted to attack unless they are first attacked. The doctrine written by Mordecai has some difficulties for some. How can one justify the Jews being authorized to destroy and to kill and to annihilate large numbers of people? Well, my answer to that would be the same answer I think our founders would have given. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. They have certain unalienable rights, among whom are life, liberty, and recently they said the right of property or the pursuit of happiness. To have the right to life, which is granted by God, implies the right to defend that life. If it is a sacred thing, which it is, then it's proper to defend it. How can anyone say that the Jews are authorized to kill children and women? Well, the text doesn't say they did that. The Persians granted them the right. The edict was written after a Persian style. We know that they did not take plunder, and there is no mention of them harming women and children either. Several answers besides what I've provided are possible. The Jews are not authorized to attack anybody. They can't go on the defense. They can only defend themselves against those who are trying to slaughter them. They are to protect themselves, not to destroy everybody they regard as an adversary or an enemy, but everybody who takes up arms against them. If no one attacked them, then they wouldn't kill anyone, men, women, or children. Secondly, the wording of Mordecai's decree deliberately copies the words of that original Persian document, which mentioned children and women. No doubt it had to in order to cancel effectively the previous decree. That children and women were included in the decree did not necessarily mean that they came under attack. In fact, the report of the Jews' victory over their enemies mentions only men being killed. Thirdly, the Jews' killing of their enemies is not the equivalent of an individual Christian's dealing with deadly force with his adversaries. The Jewish nation had to continue. It had to exist so that Messiah could come to the world through Abraham's seed. On a number of occasions in history, God authorized force against other peoples, making Israel his instrument of judgment and at the same time saving Israel. The Jews' victory over their enemies in Mordecai's day and the killing of their enemies was simply another of those occasions on which God employed physical force to save his people. I fear that our people have become too passive, and we misread some of the text, like Romans 13 and others, and try to read into the text a degree of passivism that's nowhere in Scripture. God has not prohibited people from protecting themselves. Even when Jesus sent out his disciples, he said, if you don't have a sword, sell your cloak and get one. And so the right of self-defense is built in to God's created order. And those that would be prohibiting that, I have no problem with an individual assuming the passive position. But I do have a problem with such a pacifist who would then call the police to do it for him, or allow the military to do it for him, and look down on that individual. The use of deadly force is not something that anybody should ever desire. But at the same time, we have the responsibility, men have the responsibility to protect their children and their wives and their homes. And they're justified in doing so. In verses 13 and 14, the writer records that the edict which was to be issued as a law was published in every province in Persia. This would make it possible for the Jews to be prepared on the day in which they were to be attacked, if they were attacked. And if they were, they could avenge themselves on their enemies. Speedy couriers were dispatched on the best horses in the kingdom. Special attention is given to the fact that they were given out at the citadel of Susa, the place from which the original decree had gone. It had originated, Now the outcome is found in verses 15 through 17. Then Mordecai went out from the presence of the king in royal robes of blue and white with a large crown of gold and a garment of fine linen and purple. And the city of Susa shouted and rejoiced. For the Jews there was light and gladness and joy and honor in each and every province and each and every city. Wherever the king's commandment and his decree arrived, there was gladness and joy for the Jews, a feast and a holiday. And many among the peoples of the land became Jews, for the dread of the Jews had fallen on them. And so you see that the Jewish people are a minority within this Persian Empire, and yet they have sustained a good deal of success and a good deal of support among the local population. They have adversaries. They have deadly adversaries, but they also have good friends and powerful friends. And so again, it's not the purpose of the biblical writer to deal with that political intrigue, but it's obvious that there's a great deal of it going on at this time. And after the publication of the king's decree, Mordecai made a public appearance in attire befitting the position that he now holds as the king's prime minister. And at that time, the people of Susa rejoiced with the Jews, celebrate their reprieve, and many Gentiles became proselytes of the Jewish religion. In verse 15, the issuance of the edict in the king's name has 4 results. First, it solidifies Mordecai's authority. And after this act, and perhaps because of it, Mordecai appears in public in royal dress and wearing a large golden crown. And obviously the robes and the crown do not signify that he is the king, but rather he stands next to the king in terms of authority. And this verse specifies that the robes were blue, literally violet, and white, and that Mordecai wore a garment of fine linen and purple. And the word translated crown in this verse is not the same one for the crown that Ahasuerus would have worn, but it is a sign of authority. Secondly, this caused the people of Susa to rejoice. They shouted and rejoiced. They have a lot of support there in that city. And their joy at the publication of this edict was in sharp contrast to their feelings of dread after the publication of the first decree, when the city was thrown into a state of disarray and confusion. Many Jews lived in Susa, and they are generally favored by others in the capital. But of course, they were not favored by all. They had enemies there as well as everywhere else in the empire. And when the Jews were potentially saved from extermination, their friends and their neighbors celebrated right along with them. Verses 16 and 17, the third result of the edict was that there was a day of rejoicing. This was a day of light and gladness and joy and honor, and throughout the empire they celebrate the publication of this decree by observing a feast or a holiday. And the word that is translated holiday in the New American Standard Version is a good day. The celebration anticipates the Feast of Purim that would be initiated after the Jews have overcome their enemies. Now, a cynic would wonder if the Jews were celebrating prematurely. After all, they've not yet defeated their enemies. On a given day, in spite of their best efforts, they might still be slaughtered. That's the cynic's mind. The possibility doesn't seem to have disturbed the celebrants at all. Having the right to defend themselves gave them hope, and their faith in God sustained them, and so now they believe they're going to be victorious. Next, you have the fourth response to what Mordecai writes. The solution to the Jews' problem results in the conversion of many of their Gentile neighbors. Not only were the Jews grateful for the way that Haman had been defeated and dealt with, and that they had been rescued, but the Gentiles living around them are impressed, quite impressed. In fact, many perceive the situation to be such that the Jews, God has protected them in an amazing and dramatic way, and they themselves became Jews. And the stated reason for their becoming proselytes was that the dread of the Jews had fallen on them. They had learned to respect the Jews and the God of the Jews, and indeed these events have demonstrated to them the power of the Lord that the Jews worship. In the upcoming conflict, they didn't want to be counted among the Jews' adversaries, and more specifically, they don't want to be counted as the adversaries of the Jews' God. Therefore, they converted to Judaism. Were the conversions genuine? The Hebrew word for became Jews is found only here in the Old Testament, and consequently there is some ambiguity in terms of the definition of the term. It's uncertain. Some believe that they only pretended to be Jews. There again, that is a cynical approach. The text says that they became Jews. I prefer to read the text as it is on the surface. There's no compelling reason. There's no reason at all to think otherwise. And we're grateful anytime somebody converts and follows the Lord. The chapter ends on a happy note. However, the actual defeat of the Jews' enemies still lies in the future. I hope you'll be here next time, and we'll read about that.